If you were to drive from Newcastle to Dubbo, you would go through here, the Bong Valley. In 2008, a state Labor politician bought a farm here for $3.65 million. Why would he do that? In fact, his son then bought 3 surrounding farms, one of which for $800,000 over its market value. It makes you think, what did that politician know? Well, he had to know something. That's because sitting beneath the farms was something that would make his family $26 million. Actually, that's not even true. If this politician was able to pull some more strings, his family could play both sides of a deal and stand to make over $100 million in instant profit. That politician was Eddie Obeid. And what's crazier is that scandal is just one of many. Saddle up, your blood's about to boil.
My family's entitlement, if we bought that land as a retreat for the family, and we're entitled to better our position as far as the land is concerned and make sure that there's no mine over the top of our property without us being involved in what happens.
So, haters will say that Mr. M has a Labor bias. Wait, sorry, I'm getting a call. Albo, how you doing, man? Yeah, Eddie Obeid today. Do we have to condemn him? Like, I've got this migrant success story that I think I can spin. Okay. I condemn corruption on both sides of Parliament. So, Eddie Obeid was born right here in this town called Matrite. It's about 90 minutes from Beirut, and it's so small that only 180 people live there today. When Eddie was only 6, his family moved to Sydney after World War II. And according to Eddie, he copped it for being a leb, which is definitely the most believable part of his origin story. You see, Obeid spoke about going to the University of Technology of Sydney in 1962. That's despite the fact that it only opened in 1964. Obeid also claimed to join the Labor Party in 1976. However, journalists Kate McClymont and Linton Besser point to parliamentary records that indicate that he joined in 1972. The latter would definitely make more sense because Obeid spoke about the fact that Gough Whitlam made him feel included in an Australian identity, and Gough Whitlam was elected in 1972. The other interesting thing is that from 1965 to 1975, Obeid had a pretty busy home life. After getting married to Judith, they proceeded to have 9 children in just 10 years. That's a lot of kids to feed, and so Obeid began to hustle. He was firstly a taxi driver before gaining 8% ownership in Australia's first Arabic newspaper, El Telegraph. There's this quite interesting book called He Who Must Be Obeid, great pun. McClymont and Besser write it together, and they talk about a pretty fascinating story regarding young Eddie. Obeid allegedly pushed El Telegraph to dilute their shares from 200 to 200,000. Everyone would have the chance to buy their equivalent stake, but the dilution happened when one of them, Tony Maron, was on holidays. Obeid then bought the shares that Maron missed out on. But Obeid didn't just stop there, actually using it to prevent the founder Joe Curry from looking at their books. A frustrated Curry sold his shares to Obeid without knowing their proper valuation. Eventually, Obeid would sell the paper at 4 times the share price that he paid to Curry. But El Telegraph had far more value to Obeid than just money. It was the country's only Arabic newspaper, and with the Arab diaspora getting close to 1% of Australia's population, El Telegraph could provide useful access to a growing voting bloc. When nearby residents complained about El Telegraph loudly printing into the early hours of the morning, the local Labor Marrickville Council let Obeid off. Obeid himself actually allowed Labor to run cheap ads in their paper, and he developed a relationship with one of those councillors, Leo Macleay. If you don't know who that is, he was the Speaker of the House during the Hawke-Keating years. The point is this. Macleay was a rising star within the Labor Party, and he was very well connected. And so through the printing debacle, Obeid became quite well connected himself. One of those close relationships he formed was with a faction boss called Graham Richardson. You see, back in 1955, there was a huge Catholic exodus from the Labor Party in Victoria, Queensland, and Western Australia. However, New South Wales Labor never formally split, instead dividing into factions of progressive secular people, Labor left, and conservative religious folk, Labor right. Richo was the king of the New South Wales right. And so Richo had some advice for young Eddie. Go and get yourself on a whole bunch of charity boards, and then you'll have a big enough profile for us to put you into Parliament. It's actually pretty ridiculous what he ended up doing in the 1980s. He sat on the Art Gallery Board, the Ethnic Affairs Commission, the Law Foundation of New South Wales, and the Western Suburbs Hospital Board. I mean, he actually went even further. Obeid started his own organisation called the Australian Lebanese Christian Foundation. Dinners were only $50 a head, but in some cases, patrons donated up to $3,000 checks. Which for Mr. M patrons, come on guys. In fact, at one of his dinners, Obeid secured a pretty high-profile guest speaker, Prime Minister Bob Hawke. I mean, Hawke was a pretty busy guy. It seems like a bit of a random side quest to pop in for a quick guest speaker gig, right? Well, Obeid's foundation was giving hefty donations to Hawke's Labor Party. In fact, by 1990, Obeid had swept up $120,000 for the party. So by 1991, Obeid had proven himself to the party. In New South Wales State Parliament, we have a lower house which represents small geographic areas like my little Heathcote. But then we also have an upper house where people vote for a party. The more votes that a party gets, the more people they can put into the upper house. That means that every party has an order of people who they most want to put in. Think of it like being a batting order in cricket. Labor wasn't in power and was expected to lose to Nick Greiner's Liberals. That meant that they could expect no more than 7 new MLCs. MLCs standing for Members of the Legislative Council. In other words, if you're in Labor, you don't want to be number 8. Number 7 was originally going to be a Labor speechwriter and a party historian called Graham Freudenberg. He wrote this banger of a book, but I'll have more on this in just a second. Freudenberg had given something intangible to the party, his intellect. But Obeid gave what really mattered to Richo, which was cold hard cash. Because of this, the New South Wales right was able to get Obeid bumped up to that number 7 slot. However, the election actually went worse than planned, and Labor only got 6 new upper house seats. That meant that Obeid missed out. That was until one of the other MLCs actually retired to create space for Eddie. Like today, all new members of Parliament are required to give maiden speeches. You would think that a former newspaper owner would be comfortable doing that, but unfortunately for Eddie, he happened to get writer's block on day 1. If only there was a speechwriter in the party who could offer his help. Showing absolutely zero ability to read the room, Obeid reached out to Freudenberg to ask for some help. Freudenberg said no. This was what Obeid ended up cooking up. I want to put my bit into public life, and one day, when the records of this date are written, I'll be part of it, and I'll have made a contribution. And it's nothing bloody more than that. Probably could have used Freudenberg in the end. But it turned out that while, yes, Eddie was now in public office, he was not exactly giving up on his private interests. Now, this has to be my most tone-deaf segue ever, but I'm going to give it a go. Are you an aspiring Labor politician?
At Mr. M, we have the only program in the world that teaches you your state's Labor history. This is what people are saying about it. Go click the link in the description if you want to join.
But speaking of monetary gain from being in the Labor Party, Eddie Obeid now had inside access to a virtually unlimited bank account. Yes, Labor was still in opposition in 1991, but McClymont and Besser note a couple of, let's just say, very clever deals. A Labor man at heart, Obeid cared so much about providing social housing that he routinely sold properties to the Department of Housing. For instance, in 1991, Obeid bought a property in Clovelly for $875,000, before the very next day selling it to the Department of Housing for $1.1 million. Then in 1992, he bought a property in Erina for $300,000, before once again selling it to the Department of Housing for $486,000 just a couple of months later. So Obeid gained hundreds of thousands of dollars by selling at an inflated rate to the Department of Housing. But to quote McClymont and Besser, just why they were able to do such lucrative deals with the Department of Housing remains a mystery. Who knows? Maybe Obeid just happened to have really great luck. But do you know what Obeid had terrible luck with? Fires. Before entering Parliament, Eddie Obeid had agreed to stump up $5.2 million to buy a function centre in Bankstown. This was mostly funded by a $4.9 million loan from one of our main banks, NAB. However, renovations went significantly over budget, and in 1990, Australia went through a recession.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
By 1993, Obeid and his business partner Wally Wiebe owed the bank $6 million in debt, and NAB was on the verge of seizing the centre. That was until a white knight came to the rescue. A company called Duckman approached NAB and offered to buy the debt for $2.1 million. Sure, NAB would lose $2.8 million on the loan, but it was probably more than what the centre could be sold for after the recession. NAB took the deal, but if they had done their homework, they could have made much more money in a possible lawsuit. That's because Duckman's phone was Obeid's parliamentary phone number. After the deal was finished, Duckman was led by Eddie's son Paul and his old business partner, Wally Wiebe. So if you missed it, through his proxies, Obeid retained control of the function centre while wiping out nearly $3 million in debt. Still, the centre wasn't profitable. In fact, tragedy nearly struck in 1993 when someone noticed petrol dripping through the ceiling. Thankfully, the authorities could clean it before a fire started. Obeid later claimed that it was an attempted firebombing over controversy regarding a Lebanese beauty contest. Geordies, I think I just solved your case, by the way. I mean, how lucky was Obeid to avoid disaster? It would have been a tragedy to have received a huge insurance payout on a failing investment. But on two other occasions, Obeid wasn't quite so lucky. The poor fella. In 1992, El Telegraph had caught fire after the manager ducked out for a snack and emptied his ashtray. And just his luck, the Bellevue did end up burning down a little bit later on. In the 2016-2017 Christmas New Year period, 2 fires hit the site in just 8 days. Oh, there was actually also another fire in 1993. Eddie's son Paul was on the board of a printing company called Offset Alpine. They were receiving new printing gear, and a fire happened to destroy their old gear, which was insured at replacement value, right before the new stuff arrived. Their share price actually more than doubled from 77 cents to $1.70. Eddie Obeid had earlier agreed to own 25%, but he hadn't yet paid for his shares. Still, he demanded a $1 million bonus from the $53.2 million insurance payout, and thanks to a secret Swiss bank account, was paid by the owner, Rene Rivkin. By the way, all of these fires in the early 1990s are happening while Obeid is supposed to be reviewing legislation in the upper house. So it probably is worth talking about Obeid's public life. After Labor leader Bob Carr failed to win the 1991 election, 1995 would prove to be his second and final chance. You see, Carr came from the dominant right faction of New South Wales Labor, and within the right, there was a sub-faction commonly called the Trogs. They were named after the prehistoric troglodytes. However, the Trogs had lost confidence in Carr and were known to grumble about him. So this actually left a space within the New South Wales right for Obeid to become a faction boss and to absorb a remnant that would stay loyal to Carr. And Obeid was known for having a number of tricks to get people on his side. These are all anecdotes that are documented in this book. Seriously, give it a read. The first was to simply give loans to other struggling politicians. For example, he gave a guy called Tony Aquilina a $24,000 loan that was never declared. That's pretty obvious leverage. However, the second was to make use of his many properties. Labor MPs would often take weekends at his ski lodge, which in peak season could be as much as $7,500 for a weekend. Legally, sponsored travel had to be declared if it was over $300. In 1979, Obeid also bought a beach house right here in Terrigal on the New South Wales Central Coast. So in 1992 or 1994, we get different dates around the narrative, Obeid invited a number of right-aligned MPs to his beach house. This included a future premier called Morrissey Emma, and other big names like Grant McBride, Carl Scully, and of course the indebted Tony Aquilina, among some others as well. While at the Terrigal house, the Labor MPs pledged loyalty to Carr and vowed to fight against the Trogs. So on the right, Obeid led an entirely new faction called the very creatively named Terrigals. This network also garnered a reputation for signing up anyone they could find to local Labor branches to pre-select their desired candidate. This is what we call branch stacking, and it only increased the influence of the Terrigals. In 1995, Carr was successful and led the Labor Party back into government. Obeid had played a blinder. Not only was he in the right party, not only was he in the right faction, but he was the leader of the sub-faction that was loyal to Carr. In fact, while Carr officially remained neutral in the appointment of ministers, Besser and McClymont argued that Carr publicly showed his vote for Obeid to the rest of the party to try and have him skip the queue and become a minister, even though he'd only been in Parliament for 4 years. The vote for the last cabinet position was a tie between Obeid and a guy called Bob Martin, but Obeid wasn't too upset. He knew that he had rapidly taken control over much of the party. That's because in 1995, a man called Joe Tripodi entered Parliament. He represented this area right here called Fairfield and was previously an economist for the Reserve Bank. Obeid took him as a Padawan as Labor strengthened their position. In 1999, Carr led Labor to a second election victory. As First Reserve, Obeid had no issues becoming a minister, and he became the Minister for Fisheries and Minerals, otherwise known as Cods and Sods. If this seems strange to you, well, you would be right. In order to keep the budget down, most state ministers are forced to take on multiple ministries. But as Minister for Minerals, Obeid learned the value of going on a little dig, particularly in a country as resource rich as Australia. As Minister for Fisheries, Obeid travelled to key fishing destinations such as Vancouver, New York, and the non-coastal city of London. But being a minister was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, it meant more access to resource and a higher prestige, but it also meant more scrutiny. In fact, Kate McClymont published a story that alleged that Obeid had 154 errors in his conflict of interest register. Obeid blamed his accountants, and in 2002, an independent named Helen Sham-Ho demanded Obeid issue an apology or face a vote of no confidence from the Parliament. But this incident would ignite a feud between Obeid and McClymont that would last for over a decade. There's a lot of parallels to the Bruz saga here. But the next phase of the feud would erupt in 2002. You see, a rugby league team, the Canterbury Bulldogs, wanted to build a mega site in Liverpool called the Oasis. It'd have a 35,000 seat stadium, council chambers, apartments, shops, nightclubs, and even an extra basketball stadium. The Bulldogs were working with Macquarie Bank to fund the deal. But in order for this to be a sustainable investment, it needed to have the most reliable form of income in Australia: pokie machines. This was awkward timing because at this point, Premier Bob Carr had vowed to take a strong stance against them for ruining tens of thousands of lives. However, the New South Wales corruption watchdog, ICAC, was tipped off to some foul play, and they conducted an investigation. The investigation found that the chairman of the Bulldogs, George McIntyre, was told by a director, Arthur Curry, that a $1 million donation to Labor could make their problems go away. Curry actually confirmed this, but insisted that he used the word donation and not the word bribe. So if you missed it, the Bulldogs felt as though they could bribe the New South Wales Labor government by donating $1 million to their party. And in return, they'd be allowed pokies, which would make the Oasis a profitable project. This leaves a huge question. How did Curry know that $1 million was the price that Labor were asking for? In other words, who was he talking to? Well, like I said before, the Bulldogs were working with Macquarie Bank, and the bank's leading figure on the Oasis project, Bill Moss, was frustrated at being kept out of the loop. In fact, his frustration reached such a point that he started leaking dirt on the Bulldogs. One journalist that he leaked to was none other than Obeid's enemy, Kate McClymont. Moss had two absolute bombshells on the club. The first was that when it came to the $1 million donation, the Bulldogs' source was Eddie Obeid. ICAC later confirmed that Obeid was at Oasis meetings. That is pretty strange considering that the Bulldogs have nothing to do with either fish or minerals. But Obeid's defense was that he was just doing an act of kindness for his mates that worked at the Bulldogs. ICAC's report determined that there was no conclusive proof of Obeid soliciting a bribe. But remember, I did say that there were two bombshells. An angry Moss also told McClymont that the Bulldogs were cheating in the NRL. To avoid a situation where one or two clubs hoard all of the top talent, each club is given a cap on player salaries. Moss alleged that the Bulldogs were going way over that cap. The first place Bulldogs were on a 17-game winning run when the NRL found them guilty of breaching the cap. They were fined $500,000 and stripped of pretty much all of their points. So we're a politically illiterate but also sports-obsessed nation. Out of those two stories, which one do you think the public cared about? Fortunately for Obeid, the story about him was well overshadowed, but that didn't stop him from going on the offensive. Using Mark O'Brien Legal, where have I seen them before, Obeid successfully sued McClymont for running the story and for damaging his reputation. Obeid was awarded $162,000 in damages. Quite interestingly, Obeid could actually argue that he lost his job as a result of the story. That's because after Carr won yet another election in 2003, he dumped Obeid from cabinet. The meeting apparently got so heated that Carr, as in the guy who trained to be a diplomat, threw a glass. Carr effectively told Obeid that he was a liability. In response, Obeid defended himself, saying that ICAC had cleared him. But for Carr, the Bulldogs fiasco was the tip of the iceberg. Even if given benefit of the doubt on this one, he had long failed to be above reproach and just kept inviting scandalous press. Carr even recounted one incident where the Deputy Mayor of Rockdale was found guilty of taking bribes from property developers in order to raise money for the party. At New South Wales Cabinet, Carr expressed his disapproval of that sort of fundraising, to which Obeid replied, "Someone's got to get paid." Obviously, Carr reacted quite angrily to this, but Obeid seemed pretty unfazed. According to Carr, since that point, he had been looking for an excuse to dump Obeid. For Obeid, he felt that this was a complete betrayal to one of Carr's most loyal supporters. But the good news for Obeid was that the 2003 election would be Bob Carr's final election. After a decade as the Premier, he resigned in 2005. This led to a two-horse race for the throne. For Obeid, this was great news because both of the candidates were from the Terrigals. The first was Carl Scully, and the second was Morris Iemma. When it became clear that Iemma had the numbers, Scully withdrew, leaving Iemma to win unopposed. However, under Iemma, Labor dipped badly in the polls. Firstly, they were ravaged by scandals. One was a guy called Milton Okopoulos, and go look up that one for yourself at your own peril. I'm not doing it on here. And for Carl Scully, he'd lied as police minister during the Cronulla riots in 2005. While Iemma did lead Labor to victory in 2007, he suffered a 4% swing against him. But things for Iemma worsened quite quickly. He proposed selling off $10 to $15 billion of the electricity grid to fund other infrastructure projects. This alienated many within the Labor Party, and Obeid was paranoid. In fact, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, came from the New South Wales right, and so he knew the lay of the land quite well. Disturbed by how much influence Obeid had gained within his very own faction, Keating called Morris Iemma to warn him that Joe Tripodi and Eddie Obeid were moving against him. To his own demise, Iemma disregarded the call. In September of 2008, he was forced to resign, admitting that he had lost the support of the party. But there was a bit of an issue. After Scully's Cronulla riot scandal, the Terrigals had burned through their candidates. Choosing a trog would mean going backwards, and surely Labor could never get someone from the hard left. Pardon the pun, but the only space that was left was to choose someone from over here who had good connections with the Terrigals. And that candidate was Iemma's former staffer, Nathan Rees. When Rees was elected unopposed, he removed any factional affiliation. But Rees wasn't the pushover that the Terrigals were hoping for. In fact, in 2009, Rees went to the New South Wales State Labor Conference with a massive request. That Labor changed their party rules to allow him to pick his cabinet rather than the caucus of elected officials.
I simply stand before you, trusting that you understand what I seek and the reasons that I seek it.
This was backed by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and Rees then used those powers to expel Joe Tripodi from cabinet. Obviously, the Terrigals were like, "You are biting the hand that is feeding you," and another coup was set in motion. In fact, at the end of 2009, Rees' chief of staff told him about it, and so Rees decided to get on the front foot.
Should I not be Premier by the end of this day, let there be no doubt in the community's mind, no doubt, that any challenger will be a puppet of Eddie Obeid.
This was crazy because Obeid hadn't given a speech in Parliament in 7 years. People had kind of forgotten that he existed. Imagine like Trump coming out and saying that someone like George W. Bush is really the puppet master of the Republican Party. Despite Rees' efforts, he lost to a woman called Christina Keneally. Labor was doomed for absolute annihilation in the upcoming 2011 election. And given the history of New South Wales, they knew that they would be out of office for quite a long while. And so for Eddie Obeid, that meant that there was only a couple of years left in power for one last payday. But before we get to that, I need to tell you about this. On the podcast, we did a 4-hour deep dive on Eddie Obeid and cover so much more than what's in this video. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think about 20,000 people or so will watch this video. If everyone paused it right now, clicked follow on Spotify and gave us a rating, That would 100% put us right at the top of the history charts in Australia. If you're enjoying this really specific deep dive, it is a free and easy way to support the channel. And if you do want more at the end of this video, the podcast will give you 3.5 hours more of Eddie Obeid content. But in 2007, Eddie Obeid had arranged to buy a house here in a place called Oberon. That was until his son Moses called. Eddie was en route to Orange for the wedding of a friend, and on the way home, Moses instead recommended looking at a farm right here in the Bong Valley. The friend's wedding was his New South Wales Labor colleague, Ian McDonald. Macca was a bit of a funny man. He actually came from the hard left faction of the party, earning his stripes as a Maoist and as a Vietnam War protester. But somewhere along the line, he sold out to the corporate fat cats. He'd been a senator since 1988, functionally voted with the Terrigals a lot of the time, and was known for billing the taxpayer for a lot of his personal expenses. One time it was a DVD player, and another time it was a holiday to Dubai and Italy for his third honeymoon. But in 2008, Macca had the job title of Minister for Minerals and Forests. This would be really important for figuring out just how valuable Obeid's Bong Valley farm was. As the minister, McDonald had geologists assess the coal reserve that sat underneath the farm. They concluded that it was an enormous reserve. Moses Obeid then proceeded to buy 3 adjoining properties, even paying $800,000 over market value for one of them. The Obeid family now stood to gain over $26 million in profit from mining companies who wanted to use the land. However, that would be cashing out for cheap. Remember, Obeid had the most valuable asset: inside knowledge. He knew that he was literally sitting on a coal mine, and he had connections with the minister responsible for leasing land out for coal mines. And so rather than granting the mining license to the highest bidder in a public auction of sorts, McDonald instead privately invited a handful of small to medium mining companies to come and bid. Obeid tried to get involved with one of those small mining companies called Monaro Mining NL, but realised that they were on the verge of bankruptcy and could never win the bid. Instead, he swapped across to another company called Cascade Coal. He bought 25% ownership with the condition that he would make sure that Monaro Mining would lose, which he knew they would given their poor finances. Sure enough, McDonald gave the mining lease to Cascade Coal. But a big dog called White Energy saw the profit that they now stood to make and offered $500 million to Cascade Coal to buy them out. Given that Obeid was now a 25% owner, he stood to be up to $125 million richer. But for Cascade Coal, White Energy was such a big dog that it would attract a lot of scrutiny. Given that Obeid was a public official, it was best to have him out of the picture, and they offered Obeid $60 million in 2 installments to walk away from the deal. We don't know how much McDonald's cut was supposed to be. But in 2010, ICAC found McDonald guilty of footing his honeymoon to the taxpayer, and he resigned from Parliament. In 2011, ICAC then received numerous tips about a dodgy deal between Obeid and McDonald. The media had long reported on how much his land value would increase by, but his ownership in Cascade Coal was still a public secret. So ICAC began an investigation called Operation Jasper. Obeid was none the wiser. But a month later, Obeid had an entirely different issue to worry about. As predicted, Labor got smashed in the 2011 election. They went from 50 seats to 20. In fact, in the seat of Newcastle, a mining magnate called Nathan Tinkler offered to bankroll the campaign of Labor's representative Jodie McKay in exchange for her supporting his coal project. McKay refused and she reported it to police. How crazy is this though? Joe Tripodi, remember a sitting Labor MP, helped coordinate a pamphlet smear campaign against Jodie McKay. Effectively, he committed political treason. As for Eddie Obeid, he actually survived the whitewash. Only half of the upper house contest each election, and given that he had last run in 2007, he could sit back and watch his party get annihilated in 2011. From the sidelines, Bob Carr called for his retirement, and with increased media scrutiny into the Bong Valley deal, Obeid resigned. He cited the need to spend time with his sick granddaughter, but his granddaughter was sick before the 2011 election, which would have been a pretty opportune time to step down. But behind closed doors, Operation Jasper had expanded to Operation Cyrus and to Operation Credo. Yeah, there's more. Operation Cyrus investigated the leases given to shops in the popular Circular Quay in Sydney. The area got an upgrade for the 2000 Olympics, and so shops were set to bid against each other to provide the most competitive bid. However, the tender for the key leases got delayed to 2005 and then again to 2010 by the Labor government. Operation Cyrus found that Eddie Obeid had secretly acquired 3 of these businesses: Key Entry, Sorrentino, and Art Cafe. Collectively, they made $2.5 million each year and could not have competed in a fair auction. It found that Obeid routinely lobbied his colleagues to defer a tender and that Joe Tripodi knew about Obeid's ownership. With Operation Credo, ICAC once again found some unbelievable discoveries about Eddie Obeid. So, Sydney Water was a public company responsible for controlling the flow of water. But in the northwest of Sydney, they actually outsourced to a group called Australian Water Holdings, who charged exorbitant bills to Sydney Water and therefore to the taxpayer. In 2010, the Obeids secretly became 1/3 owners. But at the same time, negotiations were taking place for a private-public partnership that would see AWH get a much bigger set of contracts. It could have been up to $1 billion, and Obeid could have made $60 million from the partnership going ahead. However, the CEO of Sydney Water was not impressed by the proposal. Her name was Kerry Schott, and she opposed the partnership. In response, Obeid lobbied Water Minister Phil Costa to sack her. Except his language was a little bit more colourful than that. Look, there's actually other dodgy stuff that Obeid did that cannot make this video for time purposes, and this video is already pretty long, so go check out the podcast if you want it all. In 2012, ICAC began publicly investigating Obeid, and in 2013, they found him guilty of public misconduct and recommended criminal charges for his role in the mining leases. This was Obeid's response.
This is nothing short of a political witch hunt against myself and McDonald, and it's backed up by the O'Farrell government.
A year later, they recommended further charges for those other debacles. There was some genuine concern that Obeid would flee to Lebanon, and so he was forced to surrender his passport. His first court case was in 2016, where he faced charges of public misconduct. Let's just say that Obeid's lawyers were clutching at straws. Their defence was that any offence committed against the Code of Parliament should be dealt with by Parliament. After all, an undeclared conflict of interest in another workplace would be dealt with internally. This is completely ignoring the fact that Parliament makes the laws and therefore made public misconduct a crime. He was sentenced to 5 years prison and was let out on parole in 2019. That was until 2021 when he was found guilty of criminal conspiracy with the mining deal and was sentenced to a further 7 years. This time, he was placed in Cooma Correctional Centre alongside Jared Hayne and Roger Rogerson. He appealed the conviction in 2023, but this was dismissed, and he was let out 2 months ago at the time of making this video. His accomplices didn't fare any better. In 2021, Ian McDonald was sentenced to 9 years prison, and he relied on legal aid. A year later, he was convicted of separate charges around misconduct in public office, and was sentenced to a further 14 years and 6 months of jail. He appealed this last year, but his appeal was dismissed. Moses Obeid was sentenced to 5 years jail, but was released on parole after 3. Last year, he pled guilty to lying to ICAC and was sentenced to 2 years prison, but this was backdated and they counted his previous years. Tripodi was charged in 2022 on 1 count of misconduct in public office relating to the mishandling of government water involving Australian Water Holdings. He pled not guilty earlier this year, but will be on trial next year. Does all of this not make your blood absolutely boil? Well, it happened right in front of our eyes. State government history is some of the most crucial to know. Click here to see how much richer we could have been if a different state government was in power in Western Australia in the 1960s.